Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Good Manager to Great Manager Chartered Assessment Guide webinar. My name is Natasha and I'm Events Coordinator at the CMI. I'll shortly be handing over to Ian and Karen, who are running the session today. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can ask them using the live chat box to the right of your screen, and we shall answer as many as we can. Today's session is being recorded and it will be shared with you later on today. Now over to Ian, Head of Member Engagement at the Chartered Management Institute.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our second webinar in the series around Chartered Manager Assessment. As Natasha said, my name is Ian Doherty. I'm Head of Member Engagement here at CMI. And it's my job to look after our forward-facing membership advisor team who answer all your phone calls and respond to all your emails, as well as looking after our new innovation team who look at offering new products and services and making sure that members maximise the usage of everything that CMI has on offer in order to make them better managers. And I'm joined today by my colleague Karen Nichols, who I'll just ask to introduce herself.
Thank you, Ian. So hello, everybody. I'm Karen Nichols. I am the Membership Operations Manager for CMI. So I head up the team who are handling all of your member-based inquiries, but also everything around the service and delivery for Chartered Manager.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Karen. So as I mentioned, this is our second webinar on the subject of Chartered Manager. And today we're going to start off with a very brief recap of what we covered last time for anybody who wasn't able to join us, and a little bit of a refresher for those that did join us last week. And then the main part of today's session is going to be led by Karen on going into detail around the assessment criteria and giving you some hints and tips on how to complete the Chartered Manager assessment. And then we'll finish off with some resources that CMI has that is available to you to help you with your Chartered Manager assessment, and also busting some common myths that are out there around the process itself. And we'll finish with a short question and answer session just before we sign off at 2 o'clock. So to start today's session, we're going to do a small recap on what we covered last time. So in case you weren't able to attend, we looked at briefly what a Chartered Manager actually is and how people's career journeys shape in order to leading to become a Chartered Manager when that sweet spot is. And that's typically after they've got 3 to 5 years of management experience that you can actually start to look at becoming a Chartered Manager. We then explored some bits around eligibility criteria and the different routes to assessment that are available for people to go through. And we finished on looking at the impact of Chartered Managers, so why people choose to do it and what the impact actually is on themselves as individuals, on their organisations and on the wider economy. And if you did miss the last time's session, it is available on our YouTube channel. If you just tap into your search engine, CMI Engagement channel on YouTube, and you'll be able to watch it if you did miss it. So just before I hand back over to Karen, I thought it'd be really useful just to recap on the 2 different assessment routes that are available. And then Karen will go through in detail the actual assessment criteria for you. So we have 2 routes that are available. The first one is known as the Fasttrack Assessment. This is also known as the exemption route. And it's a very easy 4-stage process, which is usually completed within 1 to 2 weeks. There's a registration process people that go to tell us that they actually want to do it, where we send out all the assessment documents that you need to complete. There's 4 questions on there that people need to go into some depth on, and this builds on the knowledge that people have got from a CMI level 5 qualification or higher. They then submit that information to us, which is then reviewed and assessed, and then we come out with a result at the end where the Chartered Manager status is awarded. As I mentioned, this route is available for people who have done a CMI level 5 diploma qualification or higher and have a minimum of 3 years management experience. And then the second route, which is available to everybody else, is split into 2 different areas. So the full assessment route is available to people who may have a different type of management qualification that isn't CMI. So it might be a management-related degree programme. It might be a CIPD HR management qualification, for example. It could be a whole plethora of things relating to management and leadership. Or it could be people that don't have a qualification. So it's not actually a requirement to have a qualification in order to do your Chartered Manager assessment. And this route caters for both of those audiences. And within here, there's 2 options. So for those of you who would like to write your thoughts down and are good at writing, there's the written option. And it's a similar kind of process in terms of registration. We send over all the assessment documents to you. And instead of 4 questions, there are 6 questions, which goes into a little bit more in-depth knowledge, because you either don't hold a management qualification or you hold one that we're not necessarily familiar with at CMI. So we have to ask a few more questions to go into a little bit more detail. There's then a review process, and it's backed up with a telephone interview with one of our assessors, which starts to delve into the depth of the information that you've provided. So all about application of that knowledge and finding out all about your experiences. And then we issue the results at the end of that process. And typically, it can take up to 12 weeks to complete that. If you want to do it sooner, you can do. It all depends on how fast you want to move, but the average duration is around about 12 weeks. And then the final piece before I hand over to Karen to look in more depth at the assessment process. For those of you who aren't necessarily good at writing or it's not your preferred style, we do have a route that enables you to cover the same criteria, but it's done via a series of what we call professional discussions. So rather than you having to write down all your experiences, you have 3 to 4 phone conversations with one of our assessors who will actually probe you to get the information out, and they will actually complete your written assessment for you, share the transcript with you. Once you've agreed you're happy with it, that is what is then submitted as your assessment piece. And again, that takes roughly around 12 weeks. So it's the same kind of time frame, same questions that are asked. And Karen is now going to take us through what those questions actually are and some hints and tips within there. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you, Ian. Well, let me just go back. I skipped a screen there. Sorry about that. So in terms of overall what we look for in assessment terms, so the assessment approach and the assessment criteria, they focus on the application or submission form that you're completing for whichever route you come through. You're capturing detail into that submission, into that document that's going to be evaluated, and it's going to be explored through the assessment process. So whatever you're seeing there and whatever that's prompting you to provide, that is the criteria that are underpinning the award. It's very much across all routes about a focus on your achievements and about how you've applied your skills in the workplace. It's about how you positively impact performance within your business. We do have a timescale that's incorporated here, and it's focusing on the last 18 months. And when we talk about that timescale, this is about the results, the outcomes that you've achieved within that timescale. Now, for the purpose of this webinar, and in order to pick up on what Ian was saying there around looking in a bit more detail, we're going to explore specifically the questions that appear in the submission when you're going through that full assessment option via the written option. So, first of all, the first question in the submission is essentially an introduction. It's all about setting the scene and giving context. This is about understanding more about you, about your role. It could be also about who you're currently working for, what your organisation does, or even what your department actually does, and your main responsibilities. The assessors also quite like to see here a little bit more about why now? Why is now the time that you've decided to move forward with Chartered Manager? What this particular section does is sets that scene. It gets the assessor understanding the background and the basis on which you're going to follow the questions that come forward in order to flesh out details of your achievement. But this is more about understanding you, where you're working, what you're currently doing. In terms of just a couple of tips, so if I were to say the things to do with this section, focus on what's relevant to the overall submission. It would be quite easy to make this quite a detailed section, but we're not really looking for your entire career history here. So in terms of the tips of what to avoid, don't overcomplicate this section. It very much needs to be a scene that's relevant to what you're going to describe through the subsequent questions. This is about your current role, then this is what you need to focus to build that picture and to set that scene. The second question, this is the key. This is all about your achievements. So what have you delivered for your business? How have you contributed to a positive business performance? And where you can focus on results or outcomes that have been delivered in the last 18 months. It's very much that link between what you do and what it delivers for the business. Now, obviously, this is going to be specific to you, but if we were looking at some examples of achievement, they could be, for instance, meeting or exceeding targets. It could be that you've identified a new product or a new service and you've introduced that through your business. You might have improved operations or performance in some way. It could be that you've brought an element of innovation into the way that you're working. We will see candidates who identify that they have increased profit or revenue, or that they have made savings or efficiencies in some way within the work that they're doing within their organisation. It could be that you've turned a department or a business activity around. It can be something really quite significant. Equally, it could be about you maintaining presence or performance of your organisation in difficult times. And if we think about where we are now, I can very well imagine there'll be a lot of people who've had to look quite closely at how they operate within their business as a result of lockdown, needing to work from home and so on. And if there's innovation, if there's elements that have been brought forward and identified and driven and implemented within your organisation, and you're responsible for that, that could form the basis of how you identify your achievements and put that claim forward for Chartered Manager. In terms of some of the tips for this, I think perhaps the strongest tip is to say, start with this question. You might assume that the introduction is the place to start, but really everything that flows within this submission, all the questions that follow on, link back to this achievements area. So quite often it's useful to really try and pin down what it is you want to incorporate in this section as a start point. And if you're not really clear, you might start by asking yourself the question, what am I most proud of? It could be that you come up with multiple examples of achievement. And you don't need to restrict yourself to just one. But I again would say something to avoid: don't overcomplicate this application form with too many examples of impact, because what you will find is that as you move through the subsequent questions, you're needing to back reference to all of those examples you've provided. You could make this a more complex document for yourself than it actually needs to be. So focus in on maybe one or two areas of achievement, and let's understand what they've delivered for the business. So if the achievements is all about the what, then we move on to, well, how did you do it? And this is really about focusing on skill areas. So the first skill area we ask you to look at is, how have you led people? And this is very much about what you specifically did and why. How did you approach this skill area of leading people in order to bring that achievement about? So how you did it and who you did it with. Absolutely, there needs to be a direct link between this section and looking back to the achievements. And we do ask that you give some thought and consideration into the responses you provide around an ethical approach. So within this section, there are a number of subskills. And what we ask is that you select 3, use them as headings, give this context. So this is all about identifying, here's a particular skill area, a subskill, I'm using this as a heading, and this is how I use that skill in order to realise the achievements that I've outlined. So again, if we look at tips around this, I prompt here about you giving specific examples, and let me just elaborate on that. So one of the subskill areas for leading people is that you communicated clearly and succinctly. So if you were talking about this as a specific example and using that subskill, the things that you typically would need to explore would be, okay, so this is about communication. In relation to the achievement, let's say it was a project that you had delivered. Well, what was your overall communication plan? What method or approach did you decide was most appropriate in terms of communication? How often were you communicating? And who were you communicating with? So have you had multiple audiences? And actually, was the same approach applicable to all of them? What were the benefits of that particular approach? What helped you? What worked in terms of how you decided that you needed to communicate? And again, how does that demonstrate an ethical approach? So specific example here. In terms of things to avoid, there isn't any need to cover all of the subskill headings. You're only selecting 3. And we do often see candidates who come back with their submission drafted and they have selected all 6 skills. You don't need to do that. It will complicate this process if you do. It will make it more work for you, which isn't necessary. If we move on to the next question, again, it's still focusing on skills, but this time it's all about how you manage change. So we have a similar approach. There are 6 subskills that link into this particular area. And again, you are selecting 3. You're using them as headings. So again, you're adopting the same approach as you did for the previous question, the previous section. and you're explaining what you specifically did and why, and how you did it and who with. Again, linking back to achievements, and again, underpinned by an ethical approach. So, for example, in this particular area, there's one subskill that's all about how you manage and take account of stakeholder issues. So if that's the one that you'd selected, this could incorporate, in terms of detail, you identifying who are your stakeholders. How did you identify who your stakeholders were? You've got a stakeholder map or something else that perhaps you produced. Are there any stakeholder groups that are key to get buy-in? And actually, what was your approach with them? How did you engage and communicate across all your stakeholders? Was it the same approach for all? Did you need to vary that slightly? In terms of looking at the tips, so emphasize your contribution. This is an individual award, but we do recognise that for many of us, we're actually working in a team environment. So whilst it is quite possible that achievements that have been realised for the business have involved multiple people, or maybe a team, it could be your immediate team, it could be a cross-functional team, but ultimately you need to get to what you did and what your individual contribution was. You need to explore that within your submission. It's absolutely something the assessor will look to explore with you. And in terms of what to avoid, don't just state that you did something, you need to explain it. So this picks up on what I've just covered to some degree. So for instance, if you were to say that I manage stakeholder groups, it wouldn't be enough to just put that statement into your submission. We'd want to understand the detail about, well, what does that look like? How do you manage that stakeholder group? And why is there a particular approach that you've adopted? So you're qualifying anything that you state, I suppose, essentially. What we're looking to understand with this particular section, and probably the previous section on leading people, is about the consistency of you applying your skills. It's the fact that in using your skills around leading people, managing change, that you are delivering the achievements that you'd identified in that second question. The next area is all about reflection. It's about the lessons that you have learned. So if you think about the achievement you made, if you think about how you applied your skills, well, what have you learned through reflecting? Reflect on that process. What have you learned through all of that? What are your strengths, or are there areas for development? It could be about identifying what went well. What were you glad that you did and why? Or what were you pleased that you achieved? It could also be about what didn't go so well. So if you were talking about, with the benefit of hindsight, what might you have done differently? Would it have been a different approach that you looked to adopt? Or actually, might there be a different behaviour that you think could have identified or brought about a more positive outcome? So it's equally valid to look at both what went well and what didn't. In terms of some tips for this area, the most positive element I can say about this is that feedback that we get, the anecdotal feedback that we get from candidates who go through this process, tends to tell us that this section is key. It's the one that perhaps holds the most value for somebody when they're going through Chartered Manager. It's in taking time to reflect on their achievements, reflect on why that's important for the business, what they've delivered, and actually being able to isolate the things that work, the skills, the behaviours, the approaches. What are the things that work well that you would want to replicate in the future? So in a similar situation or with another project, but equally, what are the things to avoid? What are the lessons that you've learned from that? And actually that reflective piece is a habit that we all ought to get into. I think very often, and candidates will identify with this, that we've got a piece of work, we've got a project, there's something we've delivered. As soon as it's ticked off that list, quite often we don't celebrate it, but more often than not, we don't reflect on it. And reflection is all about learning those lessons. So in terms of things to avoid, don't forget to explore here your strengths, but also your development needs. And with development needs particularly, it's quite key because it moves into the final section of this particular submission. It's all about CPD. It's all about learning and development, but it's about a forward or a future-looking view. So what are you intending to do next in terms of learning and development and continuing to build your skills? This could be drawing on conclusions from those previous sections. So where you've reflected that there's an opportunity for perhaps some of your skills, behaviours or areas there to be developed, they could feed into this section. It is equally relevant to be able to identify perhaps other things that are going on around you, where that also needs to feed into your CPD area. And we're talking about what you plan to do in the next 12 months. It's really about you showing a commitment and intention towards CPD and towards planning for what you need to do. So in terms of some of the tips that we would identify here, I'd say think smart. Sorry, I've jumped ahead there by one. You need to have some smart thinking when it comes to CPD. So here we're talking about be specific. Think about perhaps the goals that you want to have for your learning and development for your CPD. What activities would you undertake in order to meet those particular goals? Very much, and the thing to avoid here, don't make this a wish list. It does need to be much more specific, but it needs to be realistic and it needs to be planned into that 12-month period that we've identified. So all of these sections of the submission, as you're writing them up, become your description about what you've achieved, how you've achieved it, what you've learned from that experience and what your next plans are. And underpinning all of this, the assessor, when they have the telephone interview with you, they're going to be using these sections of the submission, they're going to be using the detail you've provided to steer the questions. They want to explore this in more detail. So if you've put something together that's strong in terms of your written submission, when they come to the telephone interview, it's about how you own that. And they won't go off at a tangent to look at things that you haven't identified here. The questions they ask, everything they want to explore is coming back to this document. So you've already pre-prepared for that telephone interview and for what's going to be covered. Underpinning all of that and to the side, they also look for corroboration. So there is a final section within this document that just asks you to identify who can corroborate, who can provide that additional perspective of you, of the way the work that you work, of what you deliver for the business and how your skills are applied. So that covers the sections of the submission, it covers what we're looking for, it covers what the assessors are looking to understand about you and how they will use it to move forward. I just want to hand over now back to Ian, who's going to take a look at perhaps some of these last two elements around reflection and CPD.
Brilliant, thank you, Karen. And you nearly stole my thunder by going on to my next slide there, but I'll forgive you on this occasion. So as Karen mentioned, two of the key elements to this, and the ones that people find most difficult to do, are around the reflective piece and the CPD piece. And the reflection piece, as Karen mentioned, is something that all managers and leaders should do on a regular basis. And personally, I'm missing this at the moment because during my hour drive in and out of the office every single day, I just talk to myself constantly about what went well and goes so well and how I do things differently. So learning to reflect in different ways is proving a bit of a challenge. But CMI provides some fantastic resources to help you with these two areas. And I just want to highlight these to you now. Part of a CMI's member benefits, they get access to something called our Careers Development Centre. And within there, there's a couple of resources that will really help you with these exercises around reflection and CPD. And the first one's something called a Career Wellbeing Programme. It has around 6 or 7 areas which you can see listed on the right-hand side there. And I've highlighted the ones in blue around self-awareness, career conversations and career advancement, which would really add value in terms of doing these ahead of your Chartered Manager assessment to help you reflect. And they're very simple. They're sort of like psychometric tests as such, where you answer certain questions, multiple choice, how you would react to certain situations. And it really gives you a flavour for where you're at on the different areas on the spectrum there to help you with your reflective pieces. And the second area within the Careers Development Centre is something called our Career Assessments Tools. And these are similar, but more in depth, and there's quite a few more of them there, which again, you can see the full list on the screen now. And in terms of ones that will really help you with your Chartered Manager assessment, looking at your management skills, looking at your decision-making processes, and the key one really is around strengths. So that links back very clearly to the piece within the assessment that Karen mentioned around looking at your achievements. And I know I always struggle if somebody says to me, what have you achieved today? What have you achieved this week? What have you achieved this month? And you think, yeah, I'm doing my job. I don't necessarily see it as an achievement, but it actually is. So by by doing these various assessments that we have, will really help bring that information out. And this isn't just designed for the Chartered Manager assessment process. This is something that you can do again and again, and I'd highly recommend you do this, you know, at least a couple of times a year, if not more frequently, so you can monitor your progress and track how you score differently at different points throughout the year and different points throughout your career. So that's the resource we've got to help you around the reflective piece. And then the last piece, just before we go into our question and answer and myth busting, is around the planning your CPD piece. And this is something that a lot of people do struggle with. And we have a fantastic resource, again, available through our Careers Development Centre online, where you can actually log your CPD tasks and you can set reminders on them so you don't forget about them. And this really helps bring it to life. Because CPD is one of those things that always suffers when people get busy, but it's really important to keep it up. And at CMI, we've got all sorts of wonderful resources, of which there's a selection on the right-hand side there around the number of videos, journals, and books and things that we've got for you to read to help you become a better manager and help you put this in. And I think one really important thing to mention is that CPD is not always about going on a course or doing some online learning. You know, we're always doing CPD. Natasha, who introduced the webinar at the beginning, she was saying she's learned so much by learning to run these virtual webinars. And I'm learning by presenting them, and that is CPD in itself. And so it doesn't always have to be about doing a course. Think about CPD as a wider, more holistic thing. So that's some resources we've got to help you. Just before we move into the question and answer, 3 myths just to bust for you, which answers actually quite a lot of the questions that were submitted prior to the session today. So a lot of people think completing their Chartered Manager assessment takes an awful long time. And as you've seen from today's session and the last one, it can take anywhere between 1 to 2 weeks up to 12 weeks. So it's not an overly extended period of time. The more dedicated you are to doing it, the quicker it will be done. One of those things that you register for and think, oh, I'll do that next week, I'll do that next week, that's when it starts to take a long time. So if you're going to do it, commit to it, and you'll get more out of it. The second one is around you have to have a qualification to become chartered. No, that's not true. As we mentioned at the beginning, we accept experience in lieu of qualifications because we fully appreciate that not everybody has been to university, not everybody has had the opportunity to do some learning. So we don't want to put that barrier up for people that are in that situation. And the final myth before we go back into the question and answer is a lot of people think Chartered Manager is an actual qualification in itself. And it's not. It's a professional status that's awarded to people who gain that level of professional recognition by completing the process that Karen has talked us through today. We're not actually asking you to learn new content. It's about that reflective piece and looking at the impact that you've had during your career. So there are 3 common misconceptions, and we've had quite a number of questions submitted before the session today, and hopefully that answers quite a number of those. I'm going to bring Natasha back in now by magic. There she is. Who's now going to talk through some of the questions that have been submitted today and also prior to the webinar, and Karen and I will do our best to answer them.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Karen, as well, for your very detailed walkthrough. So we have had a few questions, as Ian said. The first one is, do I have to have the job title of manager to come through the Chartered Manager Award?
I'll pick this one up. So short answer is no. You don't have to have that title. As we know nowadays, people have all sorts of weird and wonderful job titles. You don't have to have the word manager in there. Looking through what Karen's been through today, as long as you have experience with leading people, you can evidence your achievement, you've managed some form of change, and you can reflect on that and build a future CPD record, you do not need that word manager in your title.
That's great, thank you. And if someone doesn't have any direct line reports, do they actually need to manage a team to progress with Chartered Manager?
I'll jump in on that one as well. So no, is the honest answer to that one. You don't have to have direct reports. Leading people and covering that section can be done in a variety of ways. So, you know, if you're a project manager, for example, and you're involved with doing systems and processes, you're in these cross-team, cross-departmental working groups. And leadership's not just about having direct reports, it's around how you influence wider people and stakeholders within your business and obviously externally as well.
That's great, thank you. And how would you prepare for answering the questions of the assessment? Would you take a notepad or write notes about your experience? What would the process be there?
Okay, I'll pick up on that one. So the short answer is no, you don't need to take a notepad and write notes. The whole premise of this particular approach and using this submission document, that becomes your description of what it is that you've done. If you like, the submission becomes your notes. So when it comes to the telephone interview and that formal part of the assessment process, the assessor is going to be using what you've already captured into that document and explore that further with you. So the document itself becomes the notes for you and for the assessor to steer that conversation.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. And how much time is actually required in the assessment process by your nominated corroborator? And what's required of them? Because I know, obviously, in this time, a lot of people are really struggling for time in particular. So what is required from them?
Okay, so again, let me pick up on this one. It's not intended to be an onerous process for a corroborator. In identifying them, you clearly need to prime them that you want them to act as a corroborator for you. But in terms of what actually will happen, the assessor will approach them typically by email, and they will just put some questions into the email. So they'll introduce themselves, the fact that they're completing the chartered manager assessment with you, that the candidate has nominated you as their corroborator, and that they've got these questions that they would like you to answer. And typically what they're asking is that you provide responses in an email to them. So there might be 3 or 4 questions that they're looking to ask. And it's all about getting that additional perspective. So this isn't intended to be something that will take a huge amount of time. But I suppose then the answers they provide need to be detailed enough to give that understanding of you and what you're doing and how you work in conjunction with them.
Thank you, Karen. We have had a lot of questions both prior to the session and actually in the live chat. So thank you all for joining us there. We do have a question that was asked earlier by Kieran. He said, is there a minimum size company you would have to have had influence over in the past 18 months? And would there be a minimum budget?
That's a really interesting question. Again, let me pick up on that one. The short answer is no. I guess what we identify is members of CMI come from every type of industry sector, every type of organisation and every size of organisation. And what we don't do is try and set parameters over what an achievement should look like. So if you're talking in terms of, monetary gain to the organisation, well, actually, if you've got a manager who's working for a global company, could be dealing with a budget of millions, but equally you could have somebody who is an owner manager. And actually, if you were just looking at figures or numbers, it wouldn't look to correlate. But this is all about what's a positive achievement within the context of your organisation and within the context of your role. So we don't put hard and fast figures behind this. It isn't about the size of company. It's about what achievement looks like within your context and why that's important for the business. And that's relevant whether you're in a huge company or whether you're in a relatively small, medium-sized enterprise.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. We'll take one more question from the live comments, and then I will hand back over to Ian, who will go through the next steps. So Janet's asked, is there a separate process for upgrading to a chartered fellow rather than being a chartered member?
Okay, let me pick that one up as well. So if you're an existing member with CMI, so you might already be at fellow grade, and if you were to then come through the chartered process, you'd be looking to achieve that chartered award at fellow grade. If you are an existing member at our member level, then typically you're going to be coming through this process and looking to become a chartered member. What we tend to find is that if somebody actually wants to look at becoming a chartered fellow, that actually we almost separate that out. We look at the assessment criteria around the membership grades separately rather than pulling it all into the one process. All I would say is if you are working at a chartered, if you are a fellow already, if you are working at a strategic level, which is really what our fellow grade is all about reflecting, then we would expect your application for chartered manager really to be focusing on the strategic activity that you're undertaking.
That's great. Thank you, Karen. So that's all the time we have for questions today, although we will be contacting you if we haven't been able to get to your question. So I'll hand back over to Ian now, who will go through the next steps.
Thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Karen, for your technical expertise there. It's always very welcome. So in terms of next steps for you, if you want to get started on your Chartered Manager journey, all you need to do is to contact our team of advisors via the email address that you can see on screen there. If you're not quite ready to take that jump yet and you want to find out some more information, then please do take a look at our website. Everything that Karen and I have talked you through today, you'll find on there, and more detail that sits behind it. And you'll also find some case studies from people that have actually been through the process themselves, so you can look at what they've got out of it. And then finally, in terms of what we're going to send to you, so within the next couple of hours, once we've signed off, Natasha and the Fantastic Events team will send a follow-up email to you all, everyone who's registered, with some useful links to all the things that we've done today, a copy of the slide deck, and also of the recording of today's webinar in case you enjoyed it that much and you want to watch it again and again. So that's it from Karen and I. I'm just going to hand back over to Natasha, who will see us out. And thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Ian. So I just want to thank you both again for today's session. As you can see, there are some comments in there just thanking you as well for being so informative. So that's great. And thank you, the audience, for actually being here and listening to us. Remember, you can apply at any time to become a Chartered Manager just by emailing cmgr@managers.org.uk, and the team will be able to take you through the next steps, and we will be contacting anyone whose question we haven't answered today. So thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.